I think the title of this particular homily should be, Meanwhile, Back in the Year of Mercy, because after a number of weeks of the Lenten and Easter season, in which we've been hearing some pretty heavy-duty messages during our 40-day desert retreat preparing for Easter, our 50-day celebration of Easter ending in Pentecost, we've even had, in the midst of ordinary time, movable feasts that follow upon Pentecost. For example, 2 weeks ago we celebrated Trinity Sunday, the center of our faith, the ultimate revelation of Jesus. Last week we celebrated Corpus Christi, the solemnity of the body and blood of Jesus, the greatest gift that Jesus gives us of all the 7 sacraments. Even 2 days ago, on Friday, we celebrated the solemnity of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which is always the Friday following Corpus Christi, which is the Sunday following Trinity Sunday, which is the Sunday following Pentecost. Are you writing all this down? And even yesterday, we celebrated not a major solemnity, but a memorial that follows upon the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the celebration of the Immaculate Heart of Jesus. For me, it was a special day because in addition to a day in which a number of men were ordained to the priesthood for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, yesterday, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, is the feast day of my ordination to the priesthood, but not the anniversary, because it's a movable feast. My anniversary is the 23rd of June when I was ordained a priest, but the feast day in 2001 on that date was the Feast of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. It was, however, the anniversary of my diaconate, so it's kind of a combination of a number of days, along with the day in which these men for our archdiocese were ordained. But not only that, over the last couple of weeks, and the last few days in particular, it has been the season of graduation, and this evening we celebrate those in our parish who graduated from grammar school, especially those from our school, from high school, and I think there are even a couple in our midst who are graduates from college this year. So a lot has been going on leading up to this particular day, which brings us back to ordinary time. Nothing overly special, nothing great and solemn like Pentecost or Corpus Christi, but we're back to an ordinary Sunday of ordinary time with a simple message that reminds us that we are in the midst of a year of mercy called by Pope Francis. With 2 hopefully very familiar readings. The story in our first reading is of Elijah and the widow with whom he spent the drought and how he raised her son from the dead. And then an almost parallel story in the Gospel of Luke, the only gospel that tells this story, we have the story of the widow's son, also deceased. We see the great value that God has toward those who care for widows. But it reminds us in this year of mercy that we are called to have mercy and pity and care for one another. But in our Judeo-Christian tradition, as far back as the law of Moses, there have been 4 groups in particular that we must have a special care for and special attention for in our midst. And interestingly enough, in both our society, in the midst of this busy graduate season, and in this nation of ours in which we're entering into a very politically charged season, as we as a Catholic Church remember a year of mercy, a few of those 4 groups that we must have particular care for better or for worse, can oftentimes be very politically charged groups, socially politically charged groups. And what are those 4 groups? We are called from the very time of the Mosaic Law to have a particular care for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. Each one of those, at some time or another, if not our own current time, has oftentimes been a very charged group where politics, society, even charity has been concerned. For example, in our readings today, the care that is given for widows. Even St. Paul, in his letters at one time, reminded people we must care for the widows in our midst, but more than once has had to remind the widows, you are not to behave like leeches. If you can do some work and contribute, you must do so. Because even at that time, there were those who took advantage of the charitable care that the church offered. The orphans, of course, in our political mindset, especially of this country, how often do we hear of political campaigns? It could be the most outlandish and outrageous proposition or the most honorable cause. Once you say you're going to do it for the children, everyone just melts in its favor. Children are socio-political kryptonite in this country. You make it for the children and suddenly everyone's for it regardless of what it is. And we know in our nation, especially today, how in many ways we are not for the children in our culture of death, in which certain groups want a particular favor over and above the care of children where life is concerned, adoption is concerned, education is concerned. We have the group that are the poor. And always, as Jesus says, the poor will be in our midst. And sometimes that's the great dividing line of political mentalities, even in this country. Or perhaps sometimes we might hear of one political party accusing the other political party of wanting to dump on the poor, have no care for the poor, neglect or reject the poor. I don't think any party really wants that. But as the bishop in Madison, Wisconsin once said, kind of defending the two-party system and how sometimes even Catholics can be divided by parties, he says it's an absolute mandate. We must care for the poor. There is no discussion on that. How we care for the poor, we can disagree on. How we care for them. Do we care for them in a way that keeps them poor or empowers them to be successful and care for themselves? But how we go about doing it, sure, people of goodwill can disagree. And we see such disagreements in politics, charity, and so on. And of course, the immigrant. If there's ever an election in which the immigrant was a politically charged subject, it's this one, for better or for worse. But it's gospel such as this, values such as this, that at least I like to remind myself in such a politically charged time and a politically charged subject. When it comes to people in need, a person in need is a person in need. And we as followers of Christ are called to tend to those in need, even if that person is an immigrant. And whether that person is legal or illegal, documented or undocumented, folks, as followers of Christ, that's not our problem. That's the state's problem. We are called to care for all those in need. And while someone might tell me, oh yes, but Father, what if that person's committing a crime? Well, I would hope we aren't people who would only turn in immigrants who are committing crimes, but even the citizen, anyone who's a good citizen would look out to help curb criminal activity in our country. But without classification, we are called to care especially for those in need, in particular the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't get ourselves involved to help to push the agenda and the conscience of this country. And we are coming up on a primary election this particular Tuesday in the state of California. It's obviously a historical one, and folks, I know some people might not like politics, and I'm not making this a political homily by no means, but let's just say my love for history and my love for current events, I love following such as these. I mean, for some people, it's Super Bowl Sunday. For other people, like my brother, it's Academy Awards night. Me, it's election night. Those are my soaps, and I never miss them. I like seeing how the stories play out, how the election turns out, and I always like to encourage people to participate in that important process in our country, because participating in an election is at the heart of what the U.S. bishops call our love for our neighbor, because we are in effect having an impact on the future of our country and the well-being of its citizens. And whether we are ready for Hillary, feeling the burn, or hope both of them eventually get trumped, we are nonetheless supposed to participate as responsible citizens in this country, because it comes to the heart of caring for those in need. We may hear the cliches, we may hear the pundits, we may hear the accusations and the campaign slogans, but we as followers of Christ are supposed to have just one thing in our minds as we go to that ballot box, and that is the faith and the values that we profess. It's something for all people to keep in mind in every aspect of their life. I always like to remind folks, a very popular notion nowadays, to believe that there are two places in our lives in which it is okay not to be Catholic or not to emulate our values, and those two places are the bedroom and the ballot box. But we are called to emulate those values that we see in the example of Christ, in the preaching of the apostles, in the values that we profess as people of faith, and especially in this year of mercy as we as a country enter into a very important election for our nation. And while I can say I really don't care how you vote, okay, I do care how you vote. You all know that's a lie. But we won't get into that right now. We all have our political opinions, and I certainly am no exception to that rule. Let us always remember that our faith must be the guide in which we live our lives, which we raise our families, and which we participate as voters in this country. And it's also an important message for our graduates who move forward to another phase in their lives, whether they are finishing their education and moving on to the workforce to begin their career or at least begin earning a living, whether they are high school graduates who are looking to the next phase in their education, if that is where they go, whether they are our 8th grade graduates who are now looking to continue their education in high school. We must always remember that the values of our faith must be first and foremost in our lives. And we remember that especially in this year of mercy, in which we are called to show that care and that mercy to one another, and especially those in need, and especially those groups that God himself has pointed out to us. As he said, remember, you were once aliens in Egypt. Remember, you were once wanderers in the desert. Remember, you were once orphaned, and I adopted you as my people. And of course, we can certainly relate to Christ's care for the widow in today's gospel, because there was another widow that Jesus was all too close to, at a time in which the only livelihood for women were their spouses or their children. And here was a widow who no longer had her spouse and a son who had died. Jesus' compassion no doubt flowed from another widow that he knew, his own mother. Something very personal to him as he looked with compassion and pity on the widow in today's gospel. Let us emulate those values in our lives in all aspects, as students, as voters, as members of this parish, and responsible citizens in our society. Let there be no part of our lives in which our faith takes a back seat. But in this year of mercy, let us remember to have compassion and care for one another, and especially in our midst, the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant.